Hi, it's Monday now, getting close to actually teaching on Tuesday, so hopefully you guys have gotten at least a little bit of the ways into the Fountainhead, because believe it or not, I want you to have read 400 pages of this by tomorrow. It took me about 8 hours to read this when I read it when I was 15, so I'm pretty sure that you can handle that. The point of this video is to give you kind of a sense for what some of the big alternative answers are to some of those meta-ethical issues that I mentioned in the last video. Remember that meta-ethics is the study of the nature and the meaning and the justification of moral claims. Now, we're not going to make a big deal out of meta-ethics, but we need to have a couple of things set up in advance so that we can kind of understand what it is that we're doing when we go about answering ethical questions. So I'm just going to hit a few of the high points here. A large part of the point of this particular video is to try to head off the past certain kinds of emotionalism and intellectual irresponsibility that our society kind of evokes in us and to which we're tempted. So let's get into a couple of the first options in metaethics. So the first big alternative we're going to face is the alternative between what are called cognitivism and non-cognitivism. So as with a lot of alternatives in philosophical theories, one of them gets an interesting name, cognitivism, and the other one is just defined as the opposite of cognitivism. So the claim that ethical cognitivists make is that when we make an ethical claim or a moral claim, a claim about what obligations you have or which action would be right or good or what you ought to do, we're at least trying to describe the world. So if I say, I ought to cancel class and go to North Carolina, what I've said is there's a relationship between me, the referent of I, and the action, canceling class and going to North Carolina, and here's that relationship, ought to, right? And that's just as much a description of real things in real reality in real terms as the table is on the floor, right? Just as I ought to cancel class, the table is on the floor. The two sentences have the same structure. I refers to me, the table refers to the table. Go to North Carolina refers to a thing that I do. The floor refers to a thing that the table is on. Ought to refers to a relationship between me and an action. And on refers to a relationship between the table and another thing. Right? So they're both just ordinary descriptions of the world. One of them is an ethical description and the other one is a spatial description, but neither one of them is anything other than an attempt to describe the world. And of course, either one of them could be wrong. Maybe I've misplaced the table or something, or maybe I'm confused about my obligations. But still, they're at least attempts to describe the world. Non-cognitivists want to say that that is not right when it comes to ethics. They think that ethics is not an attempt to describe the world at all. Rather, when I'm doing moral talk, what I'm really doing is expressing some kind of feeling, not stating that I have some kind of a feeling, I'm expressing it. So for the cognitivist to say murder is wrong is to use the term murder to pick out a whole bunch of events in the world, all the murders. And it uses the predicate is wrong to pick out a certain property that things in the world can have, the property of being wrong. And then it attributes that property to all the murders, right? Completely straightforward, just like my phone is black uses the phrase my phone to pick out my phone here and uses the predicate term is black to pick out a certain color. And then the grammar of the sentence I use to attribute that property to this thing. Right? Likewise, murder is wrong, picks out a bunch of things, picks out a property, and attributes the property to the things. Nothing could be more natural. The non-cognitivist wants to say that that really just has nothing to do with what we're trying to do with ethics at all. When I say murder is wrong, according to non-cognitivists, I'm saying something like, boo, murder. I'm not saying that I don't like it, because that would be a description of my own autobiographical psychological states. I am expressing my dislike for murder. In much the same way as if I were to show up at a football game or something and I'd say, boo, Aggies. I'm not saying I dislike the Aggies. I'm not saying that the Aggies are a bad team or something like that. I'm expressing my not liking them. Likewise, the non-cognitivist wants to say claims about what is bad or what you ought not to do or what you're obligated not to do or what's vicious and so forth are really just expressions of feelings that the speaker has. Right? Likewise, claims about what you ought to do or what's morally good or right are expressions of feelings of fondness or pleasure. Right? So if I say being honest is good, all I've really done is say, yay, honesty, right? In much the same way that I might say, hook 'em if I were trying to evince my fondness for the Longhorns as a football team or something. We are going to be cognitivists. We're going to go ahead and take for granted that when we do moral talk and ethical talk, we're at least trying to describe the world. The reason for that isn't that cognitivism is guaranteed to be true. The reason for that is that the only forms of non-cognitivism that have any chance to be true are, when you come to applied ethical issues like we're going to do, indistinguishable from cognitivism. Right? What non-cognitivists who are sophisticated want to do is say, well, moral and ethical utterances aren't true or false or descriptions of the world in the ordinary sense of those, but they are true or false in some other sense. And then it turns out that the whole point of their theory is to try to make certain that their theory has no relevance to our practical moral reasoning, which is reasonable when you have a theory that is as implausible as most philosophers think theirs is. For instance, a claim like, if lying is wrong, then getting your little brother to lie is wrong, makes perfect sense. But what if all of that were really just boos and hoorays? Then that claim would have been, if boo lying, then boo getting your little brother to lie. And that's unintelligible. That's gibberish, right? So there are these kind of straightforward problems with non-cognitivism, and defenses of non-cognitivism are attempts to see to it that non-cognitivism is harmless. So when it comes to analyzing concrete moral issues, we might as well go ahead and just assume that there is an objective moral reality that we're trying to describe. Or, let me rephrase that, we ought to assume that we are at least trying to describe an objective moral reality. So that's the first set of options, right? Between saying that when we're doing moral and ethical talk, we're at least trying to describe reality, and saying that when we're doing moral and ethical talk, we're not even trying to describe reality, and we're going to go ahead and take for granted that we are at least trying to describe a way that the real world really is. Let's look at another option. Next big alternative we face is between a view that's variously called moral nihilism or moral skepticism, and the alternative, non-skepticism. So remember that the cognitivist wanted to say that when we do moral talk, when we talk about obligations, rights, wrongs, things like that, we're at least trying to describe some kind of a genuine objective moral reality. Well, moral nihilists and skeptics on the one hand, and moral non-skeptics on the other hand, agree with the cognitivist. But the non-skeptic thinks that we at least routinely, or at least sometimes, get it right. That not only do we try to describe an objective moral reality, but often we do, because there is actually an objective moral reality, and we at least sometimes can be right about it. Right? So the moral cognitivist will say, if you say murder is wrong, you were trying to describe a real fact in the real world about murder and its relation to wrongness. And the non-skeptic will say, and there is actually a fact in the world about whether murder is wrong, and probably it's that murder is in fact wrong. Even if murder isn't wrong, then it would be a weird fact, but it would be a fact nevertheless that murder turns out to be right. The moral nihilist or skeptic, and those mean exactly the same for us, want to say, yeah, when we do moral talk, we are at least trying to describe an objective moral reality, but it isn't there to be described. There is no such thing as ought to do. There's no such thing as rightness, wrongness, virtue, vice, any of the rest of it. So for the moral nihilist, when I say murder is wrong, I am mistaken. It is not the case that murder is wrong, and that's not because murder is right, because murder isn't right either, because nothing is either right or wrong. Why would someone say such a crazy thing? And the thought behind most moral nihilists and moral skeptics is this. Everything real needs to fit into, however complicated it's supposed to be, some kind of a physical description of the world. Everything real needs to play some kind of a role in explaining events in the world. But the goodness or the badness of something never explains anything. Let's say that I do a good thing, notionally, and I give a bunch of money to charity, and it's a good charity that actually helps people and stuff like that. Well, the money that I give to a whole bunch of people might help them, right? The fact that they have more money means that they can get more stuff, means that they can, stop focusing on just desperation, eating, and stuff like that, right? So it might be that my giving money to people increases their quality of life. But the goodness of my giving them the money, that explains nothing. That has no role to play in any of our reasoning, right? Our worldview is just exactly the same if you take out all of the goodness and badness and rightness and wrongness, right? People do things They do them because they have some kind of motives or something. The things that they do have effects, but the goodness or the badness plays no role in our explanation of anything. That's what moral nihilists and skeptics want to say. And as it goes, that's actually fairly hard to argue with, right? We want to say that the properties that things have that can explain, that can cause future events, really are their physical properties. And goodness, badness don't really seem to be physical properties of things. You can't take something into a morality lab and point a goodometer at it and find out how good it is. Right? Things don't radiate waves of goodness that are somehow detectable and have some kind of a role to play in what goes on in the rest of the history of the world. So there's something to be said on behalf of moral nihilism and skepticism. On the other hand, you might think that the moral skeptic has got things wrong, that the point of moral descriptions isn't to explain events in the world, rather it's to guide us in our actions. Right? One of those is to guide us in our praise and blame. So we need to have the concept of moral goodness so we know who to praise, and we need to have the concept of moral badness so we know who to blame. But also, we don't just have to focus on explaining events in the world, because in addition to all the things in the world that we know have happened and we can explain, there's also an awful lot of other things that we don't know are going to happen yet because they're the actions that we are still deliberating on. And it might be that the core role of moral descriptions or ethical descriptions, right, virtue, vice, right, wrong, ought not, obligation, prohibition, things like that, isn't to describe what has in fact happened, but to guide us in the decisions that we have yet to make. That's a possibility. We're going to assume that that is roughly actual. So just as I didn't tell you a minute ago that cognitivism is the truth, but it's close enough for government work, likewise here we're going to say that non-skepticism we're going to take for granted. If you are seriously a moral skeptic, then just as the non-cognitivist has to do, you're going to have to work your way into coming up with some way of doing practical moral reasoning anyway. So, as with non-cognitivism, the best defenses of moral skepticism and nihilism are the ones that try to show that it has very little in the way of implications for our day-to-day reasoning. We're going to go ahead and just steer clear of having to do all of that work and take for granted that, yes, it is in fact in principle possible to describe an objective moral reality. So we're going to take for granted cognitivism, we're at least trying to describe an objective moral reality, and we're going to take for granted non-skepticism. There is a moral reality that we can try to describe. That's not because the alternatives are false, it's because the most sophisticated versions of the alternatives come to the same when you get to applied ethics, which is our actual area.